So we've been working on graphing these things. What we're moving into today is getting into some application problems, some word problems. And I find it helpful to work through this set of problems before we get into word problems, because it's kind of the same skill that you guys are going to be using in the second half of our class today when we get into the word problems. So, so the idea is we've got a generic sinusoid here with a collection of points, but there's no scale or anything on there. So can we use the limited data that we have about this thing to write an equation? And there is enough information for all 8 of these problems for you to get an equation. So let's go through and do one of them together. I kind of don't want to do number 1 because it's a little bit simpler. But let's start with, I don't know, let's start with number 3. All right. So I'm going to start by, I like to put some numbers on these horizontal lines here. Remember, the y coordinate tells you where these are. So this horizontal line would be at y equals -2. And this horizontal line down here would be at y equals -6. And we know that that midline, the center line, should be halfway between those two things. What's halfway between -2 and -6? -4. So just by doing those 3 things, I can write coordinates for, at least the y coordinate for all of my missing points. Because the y coordinate is going to be the same as the y value for the line that it's sitting on. So everything on this top line is going to have a y coordinate of -2. Everything on this midline is going to have a y coordinate of -4. And everything on the bottom would have a y coordinate of -6. Now, if we were looking at this as, let's say, a cosine, we're going to look at it as both a cosine and a sine. But let's say we're looking at this as a cosine. We've sort of been chopping our sine and cosine periods up into these 4 sections here, right? And they're evenly spaced sections. And all of these important points, all of the points that are on here, would correspond to some points that are on that frame, right? So we know that the horizontal spacing between each of these points is uniform. So that can help us find the x-coordinates. I know if I'm looking at this as a cosine, I know that from here to here, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. She's not here, but I'll send her down if she comes in. I know that the horizontal spacing from here to here, this goes from -4 to 0, so that's 4. So that means that each of these spaces must be 2. Does that make sense? So I'm going to focus my attention on the x-coordinates here. This one's at -4, so if I go up by 2, that would get me to this point. That would be at -2. I go up by 2 again, that gets me to 0, and that fits with the data that we were given. Up by 2 again will get me to that point, up by 2 again to that point, up by 2 again to that point. You can just label these points on the graphs. If you want to write them on the blanks up there, you can, but that's not necessary for me. Anybody have any questions about how we got those pieces? So let's write an equation for this thing. We need a couple pieces of information. We need to know what our amplitude is. My midline's at -4. We're going up to -2 and down to -6. So I'd say my amplitude is 2. We also need to know our period. So the length of the whole thing from here to here. We could look at the x-coordinates and see it's -4 to 4, so that's 8. Or think about the fact that each of these divisions is 2 and there's 4 of them. Either way, we get a period of 8, and that's going to help us find our omega. And now we just need to put it together into an equation here. So let me get my format set up for a cosine equation. The instructions tell us to do both a cosine and a sine. So we've got our amplitudes 2. That'll give us our coefficient in front. We've got our omega is pi/4. We know where that goes. I just need some shifts now. If we were dealing with a positive cosine before shifting, this would have been the y-axis right here. But we've shifted which direction and how far. Am I looking at the x or the y to figure out where this is? I should be looking at my x coordinates, right? So it looks like I've shifted it to the left by 4. So left by 4 would correspond to a +4. And then our vertical shift, remember that the center line would have been the x-axis before we shifted. It looks like that center line has been shifted down by 4, so we'd have a -4 at the end. So there's a cosine equation. If we wanted to do a sine equation, the only thing that's going to change would be our horizontal shift. Everything else would be the same. We might choose a negative sign, so this 2 might become a -2, but let's go ahead and write a sine equation. The period wouldn't change, so omega is the same. The amplitude and the vertical shift don't change. The only thing that would change would be the horizontal shift. If I'm looking for a positive sign, which of those points is going to help us find the start of a positive sign period? I'm kind of looking at B. You guys looking at B also? Starting at the center line and going upwards. So that has been shifted over to the right by 2. So we'd have a -2 here. As always, I want to graph this in my calculator and check, make sure everything's looking all right. So if you guys could get your calculators out. Let's get our mode set up. Make sure that I am in radian mode. I'm not, so I'll switch that over. And you're going to need to adjust your window for each of these. You got a wacky window going on. This must have been maybe something that had radians on the x-axis. And I'm going to adjust my window just based off of the furthest to the left point, furthest to the right point, the lowest point, and the highest point. So furthest to the left has an x-coordinate of -4, so I'll make my x-min -4. Furthest to the right has an x-coordinate of 6, so I'll make my x-max 6. X-scale seems like 1 would be a good fit there. And in the y direction, the lowest point has a y coordinate of -6, and the highest point has a y coordinate of -2. So I'm just going based off of the points that I see on my graph. And hopeful that we're seeing, oops, what happened? Oh, I didn't type my equation in yet. Okay, I'm seeing nothing. That's all right. I'm going to put both equations in and hope that they overlap each other. I'm feeling pretty good about that. So when I set my window, I just used this last point, so I'm really expecting just to see that portion of it, which is exactly what I'm seeing on my screen. All right, what do you guys think? I want to give you guys about, let's say, 20 minutes or so to work on those. We will end up going over number 7 together. But if you get that far, go ahead and give it a shot before we work that together. About 20 minutes, we'll go over number 7 together, and then we'll get into some word problems. This is going to be your assignment today. These 2 pages, and then the 3 problems on the next page as well. There's 3 word problems. We're not going to do the daylight hours one. So get this done, and you guys can walk out of here without anything to worry about this afternoon. I encourage you to work together, but let's not divide and conquer. I want everybody to do all of the problems. Let me know if you need a hint.